Hello everyone, welcome. Welcome to all of you who are joining us here in Sharm el-Sheikh. Welcome to all of you at home. I'm Jeevan Vasagar, I'm climate editor at Tortoise. We're here to talk about dairy today. First of all, thank you very much to the New York Times who are hosting us in their space at Sharm el-Sheikh. And thank you to Upfield who have co-curated this session with us. We're here to talk about food. And I think food is one of those really interesting things, which is both incredibly intimate and personal and a daily routine thing that we do. And it's also the product of a vast system and of choices that we think are independent but are actually being made for us often by other people. We're here in particular to talk about milk and butter. When we think about greenhouse gas emissions, I think everyone's aware of the impact of burgers. Everyone's aware in general of the impact of meat. We have much less awareness of the impact of milk and cheese. I'd like to open by talking to Sally Smith, who's Global Director for Sustainability, ESG and Sustainability at Upfield. Sally, why are you trying to take cheese away from us? What's wrong with cheese?
Cheese is delicious, but let's be clear, there's other things out there that we can eat that don't have the impacts on the planet or our health than the dairy industry, and that is cheese, it's milk, it's butter, it's cream. And these are products that are ubiquitous in our lives. We choose them every day, but there are genuinely fantastic, tasty alternatives that don't come with some of the costs that aren't built into the system for them today. And we know that agriculture accounts for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. Of that, meat and dairy account for conservatively 14.5% if you take the most conservative numbers that are out there, without tackling not just how our food is made, but what we choose to eat. We're going to have a real challenge to meet both the planetary boundary targets as well as climate change targets that we have, accounting for some of the damaging impacts of animal agriculture on the planet, as well as tackling some of the human health challenges that we have. And we need to find a way to do that in a way that's equitable for all and addresses some of the disparities globally on it.
So we think of dairy as something as relatively benign, I guess. I mean, it doesn't have quite the same impact as meat. Are you saying that's a bit of a misperception?
So cheese specifically would come third after beef and mutton. It is a significant contributor in terms of greenhouse gases, and particularly dairy products, because they come from cows, have a real challenge when it comes to their methane footprint. And we know as a short-lived, very potent greenhouse gas, unless we find a way to tackle that dramatically quickly, we're going to have a challenge on our hands, right? So the methane pledge is a fantastic piece of work, but right now it only addresses the fossil fuel industry, even though agriculture accounts for 40%, the greatest proportion of methane. So we've got to find a way to have a better conversation, a better discussion that leads to rapid action on shifting consumption patterns. And what we currently eat today is created by the system we've created, and it's within our gift to create a new system.
So is this to do with what we eat, or is it to do with how much we eat, or is it some combination of the two?
So I think it's a combination of a whole load of factors. It is indeed how it's produced, but there's lots and lots of conversations on production systems and what a good production system can look like. There is less discussion, and because of the need for rapid action here, we're interested in how we push the conversations that aren't necessarily happening as rapidly as they need to happen, to have that discussion about how much we eat and what we choose to eat. So choosing to eat significantly less meat and dairy, particularly for the global north, Europe, North America, where meat and dairy consumption is incredibly high. That needs to shift, and needs to shift rapidly.
Right. I should say to all of you here in this room, this is a think-in. We welcome your contributions. My colleague Barney McIntyre is holding a helpfully Tortoise-branded mic. Do catch my eye or catch his eye, and we'll welcome the contributions very early on. You don't have to wait till the end to ask questions. Susan Chomba of the World Resources Institute, you're Director of Food, Forests and Water there. Sally's just given us a picture of overconsumption, I guess we would say, in the global north, something that we all recognise is true. In Europe, I think I've heard it said that we eat perhaps twice as much protein as we really need for our health. But this picture isn't the same across the world, is it? How different is the situation in terms of access to protein, would you say, in Africa and other developing regions of the world?
I think very, very different. First of all, let's unpack the dairy industry in developing countries, and especially in Africa. I'll be speaking specifically in Africa. This is a sector that is predominantly produced by smallholder farmers, smallholder pastoralists, and you have mainly three types of systems that produce milk. You have the predominantly pastoralist system that is really part of the pastoralist culture. So livestock obviously is more than dairy, but dairy and meat is part of their livelihoods. And so the cultural, the livelihood system is all completely interlinked with their livestock. And even within that system, you have those that are predominantly dependent on cows, and others, countries like Somalia and countries like Sudan, where the milk is coming from camels. Most of the milk is coming from camels. And secondly, that most of these pastoralist farmers, so you have, let's first distinguish. You have the pastoralists, and then you have agro-pastoralists, who are farmers having cropping systems, and so they have alternative sources of protein. For pastoralists, their predominant also feeding system is from food is coming from their livestock. So you remove that, and you're basically removing most of what they should be consuming anyway.
Yeah.
And then you have the agro-pastoralists, who have other sources of protein from their beans, from other legumes that they grow, but also from dairy. Okay. And last is where you have intensive systems of basically dairy production that is geared towards obviously some home consumption, but also the market. And it's important to understand these dynamics, because the food security, nutrition security amongst these groups will be totally different. As I mentioned, for the pastoralists, if you remove it, basically what other alternatives are you providing, and are those alternatives even acceptable within their social cultural norms? And what we are seeing now is huge food insecurity on the continent. At least 200 million people every year do not have sufficient food to eat. And that's not even going to the extent of looking at the nutritional values, because it's one thing to fill your belly, it's another thing to actually have nutritious food that is full of the nutrients that you need. And there are demographics that are particularly affected, and those include the children and women. And for dairy, this is critical, because for women, as we grow older, our bones are losing calcium, and if you're not having supplements, then you tend to suffer from osteoporosis. And for children as well, it's very important that they have the calcium that they need in their system to grow. So what I'm saying here is that we need more dairy for a lot of people in developing countries. We need a lot more dairy for children, for women, because the luxury of having alternative calcium, alternative protein is not there. And so really, and also just to emphasize that if you look at the sector, what really we should be thinking at is the feeding system of the livestock determines the methane that is coming from the livestock. And for pastoralists that are really, pastoralist systems do not produce as much methane as when you have intensive feeding system, stall-fed system, and livestock. So we need to distinguish those. And finally, also emphasize that, of course, Africa as a continent contributes to less than 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, and even less of those will be coming from the livestock sector. Of course, methane is still there, but it's not as huge as what you see in the developed countries.
Yeah. So you've covered a lot of ground there, Susan, and raised something that I really want to kind of come back to in this discussion, which is, what does a good future look like for the whole world, really? What is the system of production? What should consumers be doing? So both of those things together, and we'll come back and dig a bit deeper into this. Before we do that, very pleased that you're joining us, Lou Hunt, from the Ministry of Primary Industries in New Zealand. Thank you. And you're Manager for International Environment there, I think.
Yes.
One thing that I particularly want to hear from you, Lou, from the New Zealand perspective, is a proposal that I think has just come out, or just recently come out, about the pricing of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Now, firstly, could you just put that into context for us in New Zealand? Roughly what proportion of your emissions is from agriculture? So how big is the problem?
Yes, we do have an unusual context in New Zealand, whereby agricultural emissions make up 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions, which is an aspect of it is that our energy is largely renewable, and we export a lot of dairy and beef and lamb, and so So to meet our nationally determined contribution, New Zealand, we've been talking for years. We've had an emissions trading system in place to trade CO2 emissions, and we're finally at the point now where we're just gone out for consultation in New Zealand on a domestic policy proposal to price agricultural emissions. So we're looking at pricing methane as well as long-lived nitrous oxide as well.
And just tell us, how does that work exactly? So how do you I know that there's probably a long answer and a short answer to that one. But,
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and actually a lot of the detail is what is currently out for consultation.
Right.
But it looks like we legislated domestically some methane targets for 2030 to a 10% methane reduction, and by 2050 a 24 to 47% methane reduction. And the way that we plan to get there domestically is a question that we went out for consultation on, and have when the methane reduction targets were legislated, the agreement was to be pricing ag emissions by 2025, and so that there is a backstop, I guess, a scenario that no one seems to be that on board with, is bringing agricultural emission pricing into the emissions trading scheme, and the alternative was a question put to a collective group. So we worked alongside industry and Māori, local Indigenous groups to propose back to government on-farm emissions pricing system, and they toyed with some other options of at a processor levy at a processor level, but the industry have come to government with the request for that enables them to make change at a farm level. So New Zealand farmers are going through a range of, in preparation for this, knowing your numbers, like knowing your on-farm emissions, and government is supporting the setup of the on-farm plans around this, and the government has now taken the proposal from He Waka Ika Noa, the partnership. It's a Maori whakato. It means we're all in this together. Yeah. And the options that were proposed by He Waka Ika Noa have been considered by government, and government has now just put out this policy proposal, and consultation runs for 6 weeks, and we're not far into that.
Okay, so it might be early to ask you this question, but what is the initial reaction from farmers?
Well, I heard our minister at the OECD Agriculture Ministerial last week make the comment that that the farmers, that industry are on this He Waka Ika Noa, and that there are sort of small tweaks to the proposal that government has come back out with, and of course farmers are hands in their ear saying it's really difficult, which I guess is what government expected.
Right. Okay, it's the opening of negotiation. All right. So we've really kind of covered a lot of ground there, Sally, and I just want to come back and think about two things really together. One of them, maybe a starting point, is to think about the perspective of farmers and the people who are sort of producing our food. They're just doing what they're incentivized to do and what they've been told to do, isn't it? Which is to sort of feed the nation, and what they're subsidized to do, I guess. So they're producing huge amounts of meat and milk in Europe and in the UK. What's the way to reset the system in a way that doesn't create chaos and doesn't really sort of upend things for agriculture? I mean, how would you begin to do that and begin to think about that?
So I think it's important to think that we possibly need a little bit of upending of the system, because it isn't fit for the solution that we need for the future, and to be careful and conscious that this is a full interconnected system that we're trying to shift over time. But let's be clear, the system we have has been created by us collectively, and the set of incentives, policies, rules on things like labelling, the way in which we incentivise public procurement, the choices that we put into the average meal plate that we suggest is what a national consumption pattern should look like. All of those things shape what we eat, and it's shaped by the meal that your mum or your dad put on the table when you were a child. It's shaped by what you were served in a school setting, the things that become part of your cultural identity, the food that you choose. All of these things shape what we do. And because those things are shaped by us, we can reshape them and we can make some choices about how we do that. And the current system, in lots of ways, is tipped towards the system that we have today. And if we accept that it doesn't quite deliver on the total systems outcomes that we need, and if we continue on the trajectory we're currently on, we're going to be in a whole heap of trouble. What do we need to do across all of those factors, whether it's the way we show products in a supermarket, the choices that we make in recipes, all of that space we need to rethink and restitch a new set of positive incentives around to encourage people to eat significantly more plant-based diets, and we know that's needed from a planetary perspective, from a human health perspective, and within that recognise that farmers are at the forefront of growing plants as well as animals, and that for some systems meat is going to be needed. The conversation that we were talking about earlier about particularly the global south and Africa, where there are nutritional deficiencies we have to be very conscious and careful about. And then where we have the necessity to include livestock within systems, because they do form part of that, but only to the extent to which the system can maintain that. And at the moment, we've tipped beyond the balance of what's possible for that system to hold. So where you have way too much meat and dairy, we're seeing that flowing over into literally our waterways, our watercourses, the challenges in terms of that sheer level of consumption we need to have a better and more honest conversation about. So yes, some farming systems with small amounts of livestock included can be part of that solution, but the level of livestock that we're currently predicted to have to feed populations in the same way as we would feed, somebody living in the UK where I'm from, or somebody in the US, we have to be clear that the globe can't substantiate. So that demand side piece about how we help consumers make better choices, there's some great things that we can do to help them shift, fantastic recipes, great food choices.
Before we go on to that, Sally, actually I want to stay on farmers and ask, are there any farmers in the room? It's a bit of a loaded question because I know there is at least one farmer in the room, who I might call on to give a farming perspective in a moment, but before we do, let me just come back to the question of kind of production and say, do you have a sense of kind of what the priority is as far as farming is concerned? So particularly after the war in Ukraine, the emphasis has been on food security, the emphasis has been on food production. How do we bring a sense of kind of environmental impacts back into that conversation as far as farmers are concerned?
So one of the things that I think farmers have been brilliant at is responding to what the system asks them for. So if they're incentivised to deliver fantastic secure food systems, they're pretty good at doing that, right? They know how to manage the land. It's their day-to-day lives and livelihood depends on it. So we need to find a way to help them transition towards growing things that actually on a total systems level make the system sustainable, because the current production process doesn't help with that. And if it's a demand signal that goes all the way back down the supply chain to potentially, farmers that sometimes are quite disconnected in that total system, and we need to bring them to the forefront of the system and the system's conversation, how do we make sure that what we're getting our farmers to grow, to nurture for us, delivers the outcomes that we need for the total system? How do we get consumers, people, citizens, to make those really great informed food choices that make sure the farmer can respond to it as well?
Did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think there's something in there as well around efficiencies. how do we ensure that we are, planting the right crops and producing the right food in the right place. I think the multilateral trading system is really key in that. And I think that it's critical to look at where the big inefficiencies are. Where are we subsidising production that we don't need? Where are we where the food security kind of front of mind current balancing of these triple challenges of how do we produce enough food while doing it sustainably and ensuring livelihoods. That a lot of the conversation the last few days at the OECD Agriculture Ministerial was around considering what goes into price distorting and environmentally harmful agriculture subsidies. And the World Bank stats are mind-boggling. We're talking about 800 billion, and they're talking about even half of that to support sustainable systems would fix a lot of the issues we have. And
And when you say producing food in the right place, what would you say we should be optimizing for?
Well, again, I think it's a balance across those challenges. I think you run into problems if you optimize for one.
Sure.
Yeah. So you're optimizing for feeding growing population sustainably, and that's a policy wonk answer, right? Like that's you can't pick one over the other. You need to if there was a silver bullet, if this was easy, it would have been done by now. And so we need to we need each of these approaches to we need all of the thing that really struck me in the 2 days of conversations at OECD was the breadth of responses that on a policy sense, on an on-farm sense, and we need to be doing all of this to transform the food system.
Yeah.
Patrick, can I ask you to come in on this? Farmers and food companies have obviously been thinking for some time about their impact, about sustainability. Where would you say the conversation is at now from a farmer's perspective? And if I could ask you to say a few words about yourself as well.
Well, I think there's massive confusion all around, but I do absolutely agree with the questions, the challenge that you've just raised, which is how can we feed ourselves sustainably in terms of climate, nature, health, resilience, and what are the farming systems which are needed to achieve that? And then I would argue we should link our future diets to the productivity of the systems which will achieve those three objectives. So I didn't know the answer to the question, what would I eat if I wanted to align my future diet to the output of a sustainable agriculture? So my organisation, I'm a farmer, a dairy farmer, declare my interest, we did a study which is called Feeding Britain from the Ground Up. And what we did was we notionally transitioned the whole of the UK, all UK farming, to regenerative systems. We defined what that meant in the opening chapter. So circular economy, farming in harmony with nature, moving really to biologically based systems, and turning our back on non-renewable external inputs. And we calculated not only the productivity, but actually the different foods that will be produced by that system. And then we divided that by 70 million, and then we got the diet that you or I would eat if we made a commitment to eat the food that would come from the sustainable farming systems. And there were some very surprising conclusions. More vegetables, of course, and fruit. But actually, if you're going to transition agriculture, which at the moment is crop after crop, year after year, to biologically based systems which build fertility through crop rotations, the typical crop rotation in the UK would be 50% fertility building, and fertility building is grass and clover. The only way we can turn grass and clover and cellulose-based crops into food that we can eat is with ruminant animals. So fast forward to the dietary conclusions, lots of vegetables and fruit, much less grain would be produced, more than a 50% reduction overall, which would mean no more cheap chicken, no more cheap pork, and no more products from mega dairy herds. But, this is the surprising bit, more or less as much dairy products as we are eating at the moment, and beef and lamb as well. because in the case of the UK, 2/3 of the agricultural area is grass, and the only way we can turn grass into food is through grazing animals. And if we don't eat those products, we actually make it impossible for the farmers to transition. So this is really at odds with the discussion you've been having and with the current scientific orthodoxy globally. So what I'm saying is quite challenging.
Okay, thank you,
And
Patrick.
by the way, I produce 40 tonnes of cheese a year from 300 acres in West Wales, and we haven't used a single kilogram of nitrogen fertiliser or any pesticides for 50 years.
Okay,
And
thank
we're
you.
building solar power.
Thank you. We'll come back and say a bit more about diet in a minute, but first, Barney.
I just thought I might share a point from the chat. Vanessa Wolf says, it's interesting to think about how the British government tried to influence populations' diet choices during World War II. This is a possible starting point for shifting attitudes. I wonder if there's a kind of urgency question that needs to be addressed in that.
It's a great question, and I want to get into the subject of diet that Patrick has raised and Vanessa from the chat. If we think about the future, it obviously relates to kind of what consumers should be eating, what they're expected to eat. What does a sort of planetary diet look like? I mean, we have some idea of what that should look like, don't we, Sally?
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of different models of diets that people espouse. What we do know is that diets with significantly less meat and dairy than are currently consumed in the global north, and significantly more plants, is a more sustainable choice and a healthier choice. Whether you're fully vegan, vegetarian, flexitarian, you're choosing to shift, we're starting to see some of those behavioural changes already. So people start to understand that inherent health benefit of having a plant-based diet, and whether you look at Eat Lancet as an example of a balanced plate of food, something that is plant forward and that we find ways to inspire people to eat delicious things, right? There's this cultural norm that says that your plate isn't going to taste great if it doesn't have something that comes from an animal on it, but the reality is we all eat meals every day that don't rely on animal ingredients. So how do we make that more of the societal and family norm about the choices that you make round the table every day and the things that you delight in eating and sharing? And then how do you shift the system towards that? So if you sort of accept the macroeconomic macro analysis that says we need to shift in order to stay within planetary and health boundaries, how do you then shift the system towards a diet that looks more like that? And I mean, being a consumer goods company, you know, we make plant-based foods, products like Violife as a vegan cheese, for example. How do you ensure that when a consumer goes into a supermarket, they can make an easy choice, it's an informed choice, and they know that this is a product that does the same thing as a cheese, is labelled in a way that allows them to access that really simply and easily? And how do you make sure that they have good information about the comparative impacts of those products? You know, how do we make information on labelling available to the consumer so that they can make a distinction, and where they want to make that choice because they recognise that impact, they can do that.
I was going to ask Susan to come in on this actually, and just to say, if we think about dietary transition, we're obviously in a situation now in parts of Africa and Asia where people are going through a dietary change, which is similar to the sort of post-war transition in Europe, where there's much more availability of meat and dairy. And I think one of the points that we were thinking about earlier was whether the developing world can avoid repeating some of the mistakes that have been made in the global north. Susan, how should people in the global south really be thinking about this? And it's a sort of complicated conversation, isn't it? Because I guess you don't want to say is, well, you can't have those nice things that everybody regards as aspirational.
Yeah, no. First of all, just because we are at a point where we need more nutrients, we need more food available, doesn't mean that we don't need to think 20, 30 years from now. Africa is one of the fastest growing continent in terms of population. And to continue feeding, currently we're at 1.2 billion, and in the next by 2050, it's expected to double to 2.5 billion people. And to feed that kind of a growing population, it means that we are going to continuously have pressure to increase productivity and shift our diet. So the question is, how do we think about that 2050? How do we think about the 2.5 billion people now, instead of precisely what you've said, getting to that point and then realize, oh, now we've equally contributed to a lot of nitrous oxide, methane, and everything else. And now, we can actually, that's why I say for food systems in Africa, we have a fantastic opportunity to leapfrog the systems. And not just leapfrogging, because the beauty about it is that a lot of our farmers have got significant amounts of knowledge on what you're talking about, like regenerative methods of farming. What has really eroded that is a push towards the green revolution over the years that has been the catastrophe that has led to, sort of specializing on a few crops, specializing on a few ways of producing food, a few inputs, chuck it in, and then you get the system out. But if you look at the amount of knowledge that exists at the local level for building sustainable, resilient food systems, Africa is at a place where we don't need to go very far. In terms of the shifting food, in fact, what I was saying, we need shifting diets in my continent. It's not because we have a lot of meat consumption and milk consumption. We need to shift our diets to embrace the thousands and thousands of diversities of vegetables, of legumes, and that are traditionally known. And a lot of Africans know the moment you get, you go to the hospital in your 50s or 60s and you're told you have diabetes or you have something else that is as a result of, lifestyle or diet, kind of lifestyle diseases. We know what to shift to. That's when they go back to our sorghum, pulp, our traditional vegetables. Somebody will not touch cabbage now. But they're like, why do we have to wait until we get to that point where people are unhealthy for us to embrace the diversity? So I think the shifting of diets, it's embracing the diversity of what we have. It's embracing the farming systems, knowledge systems that have traditionally been very sustaining people on that continent for thousands of years. And that is what we need to embrace in terms of food systems transformation, and creating incentives, finance incentives, market signals, and feeding, behavior signals that are saying this is the healthy way to do things. It's not just you growing a few crops using a certain number of, I think that green revolution thinking needs to change. And with that, we can be able to transition the food systems to more diverse systems that can be able to feed a growing population without expanding into the natural ecosystems that we so dearly need to save.
Right. Great answer. Patrick?
Just one sentence. It was the intensification of plant production through the Green Revolution, exactly as you said, which has caused unsustainable livestock production. If we'd never had the Green Revolution and intensified plant production, we wouldn't have all this unsustainable meat. It's the chickens and the pigs. And the failure of this discussion is not to differentiate between the animals which are part of the solution and those which are part of the problem. But may my colleague say something, because I think she wants to say something as well.
And I also think it's about the price of that, right? Like it's the
True cost accounting.
true cost accounting, absolutely.
Yeah.
And did we had a hand raised at the front here, I think. Yeah. Sorry, before we come to you, Adele, if we can. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I really want to say thank you for addressing this super important topic. I want to respond to two statements made. First of all, the health statement you made, so that countries with really low dairy consumption at the moment need more dairy to get calcium, for example. I think that's very problematic because there's studies showing a very clear linkage to high dairy intake and osteoporosis in global north nations that have a lot of dairy consumption. So I don't think that's a really good way that countries in Africa should be taking when they are looking to get sources for calcium. Then I think we should be looking at leafy greens, nuts, and stuff like that, because also the pastoralist way of life is very much endangered by climate change.
Yeah.
Because the animals are just dying from the heat. And then I want to respond to your claim that we have to use pasture, or we have to have animals, grazing animals. I think New Zealand is a very good example where a lot of grazing ruminants have really ruined the biodiversity and waterways of the country. And I just want to give maybe another perspective how this land could be used. For example, farmers can be paid to rewild this land. They can use grass for energy production, for example, in biogas factories, or so I really think.
Thank you. Could I just ask you who you are, if you don't mind?
Yeah,
Tell me.
sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't introduce
Yeah, it's okay.
myself. Yeah, my name is Max
Yeah.
Weiss from the Plant-Based Treaty.
Okay.
And so, yeah, we are campaigning for a transition away from animal production, really.
All right.
And
Thanks for your contribution, Max. Let me come back to you, Adele. Don't feel that you have to respond directly. This isn't the House of Commons, but feel free to make your contribution.
I think the point, Adele Jones from the Sustainable Food Trust, the point I wanted to make, I think, feeds into all of this and relates to the data that you put on the slides at the beginning, particularly the data looking at global averages of CO2 equivalent emissions per kilogram of product. Beef and dairy come out obviously very badly. And I think the key here is nuance, and the nuance needs to come from the data. Like, every farm is different, every farm has a different impact, and therefore using global averages to decide on the future of agriculture is super dangerous. And so we need more primary data. We need every farm to be measuring their impact in the same way, so that we can understand the complexity of the systems and the nuance within them, so that, yes, there are lots of beef and dairy farms which are causing significant damage in the States and Asia, but there's a lot that are part of the solution. And by measuring in a holistic way, we can, address some of the points you raised. Is that piece of land best used for agriculture, dairy, or should it be used for something else? I think in grass-based nations like New Zealand, like Western Europe, we're very good at producing sustainable beef. It doesn't mean the rest of the world is like that, but we need to major on what we're good at doing in different parts of the world. And so we would argue very strongly for common measurement at farm level to provide that primary data, so we can make much more informed decisions about the future of diets and agriculture.
Yes, sure. Sally.
I think we would agree, and I think farm level data is really important. And I would suggest that to tackle the scale of the challenge we have to do more than that. And the data is good enough to suggest that the level of consumption of meat and dairy is also a problem. So yes, farm level activity and farm level difference is fundamentally important to the transition that needs to happen here, and the practice that needs to shift at a local level is going to be different in those different systems. But we can't ignore the fact that a third of global greenhouse gases comes from the agricultural sector, and a significant proportion of that comes from the consumption of meat and dairy. And if we don't talk about consumption as well as production systems, we're not going to stand a chance of hitting overall climate targets. So the way in which we frame the discussion as either or, I find unhelpful. We need to act across multiple levels and layers of action here, and make sure that farmers get the right support to grow the things that we need to be eating in the system, to make sure that we have a system to eat in 20, 30, 40 years' time.
Luke, can I come to you on the question of consumption? So, I mean, New Zealand is one of the countries which is an agricultural superpower, producing lots of food for export. Do you have a view on whether a producer country like yours can help to make global diets more sustainable, global diets greener? I mean, I guess putting a price on the greenhouse gas emissions of your farmers is a step towards doing that. But are there other thoughts that you have about how you can contribute to this conversation?
Well, yeah, I was going to say absolutely. That's what's at the core of this policy proposal. I also think there's a lot of good work through the Global Research Alliance on sharing. And even the best practice methodology work, having, we don't have, it's taken many a climate change COP to have agreed global common metrics for how we're reporting CO2 equivalents. Now you transfer that to the complexity of what a sustainable diet is, and there's an absolute plethora of green ticks that you can purchase. And so we're also in New Zealand trying to focus on work that, I've lost my word, best practice methodology at a macro level.
Right.
So through FAO, looking to, there are many ways that you can announce your, look into the life cycle assessment of your product, but let's look at a global common metric for that, so that when we say life cycle assessment, we're comparing the same product parameters that you are in the UK, and there's some really good work through FAO looking at exactly that, global best practice for life cycle assessments that just have so many more variables than looking purely from a climate perspective across other environment metrics. Yeah.
Okay. In the few minutes that we have left, I just want to come back to the question of consumption and consumer behaviour, and we've touched on this a few times. But one thing that we were saying, kind of when we were speaking before this debate, was that the phrase "less and better," and I think you said that we're good at the better part.
Yeah. So
maybe less good at the less.
So we hear lots and lots of conversations about better, and I think better is really important when it comes to farm practice and that transformation on the ground of agricultural practices. But the less question, and we talked a bit about the framing of less meat and dairy is a critical part of that, but maybe we need to reframe it as more plant-based products, more tasty, delicious alternatives with lower impacts that are better for the planet and better for your health. And think about the opportunity that might bring for people, for citizens around the world, because they have fundamentally better diets. And to frame it as, instead of a barrier to change, an inability to have a conversation with consumers because I'm too scared to tell you what to eat. I don't want to have that conversation and vilify you for your food choices. It's not a great opener for a conversation. But how do we find a way to have a really engaging discussion about the most delicious things that you can eat, that are the most sustainable things as well, that make you feel inherently good internally? And how do we then translate that onto the shelf, into the supermarket, into the incentives that the system supports, the subsidies flow in the right direction, all of these trigger mechanisms, VAT levels on certain products and food that show up for the consumer, because at the end of the day, there is in many countries a cost of living crisis. When people turn up at the shelf, price is still going to be a big factor in that consumer decision. And if what we're offering people is cheap meat, they're going to choose cheap meat and cheap dairy. And if they're the things that get promoted for a consumer, then they will naturally still stick with the system that they've got. So we need to think about how you can change all of those consumption levers, the menus that you get in restaurants, the stuff that your kids eat when they go to school. How do we shift all of those factors? Because the scale of the challenge that we have here is so immense that it's going to take shifting on every single front, whether it's the better part of it, the less but better in terms of what we produce, where it's produced, how it's produced, as well as the choices that we make.
Thank you all very much for giving us your attention. I think this is a brilliant microcosm of some of the other challenges we're talking about here at COP, because it involves companies and governments that can do things at scale, but are watching consumers to see what they do, and all three have to interact together to make this system move. So thank you all very much for a brilliant contribution to the conversation. Thank you for your attention in the room and for joining us online. We'll be back at 3 o'clock Egypt time, 1 o'clock GMT tomorrow to talk about plastics. Thank you. Thanks very much.